The night was unusually quiet. On December 25, 1776, as icy wind cut through the Delaware River, no one in the nearby villages could hear the sound that would change the future of the world. There were no drums, no trumpets, no speeches, only the slow creak of wooden boats, the muffled splash of oars, and the heavy breathing of exhausted men whose boots were soaked with ice water. Many of them had no shoes. Some wrapped rags around bleeding feet. A few whispered prayers. Others said nothing at all, staring into the dark, knowing that by sunrise history would either remember them or forget them forever. At the front of the crossing stood a tall, silent man wrapped in a blue cloak. Snow collected on his shoulders. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of something far larger than the river before him. George Washington did not know if this gamble would save a rebellion or bury it for good. What he did know was this: if they turned back now, the idea of the United States would die before it was ever born. That night was not just about a battle. It was about whether ordinary people, farmers, laborers, immigrants, enslaved men dreaming of freedom, could defy the most powerful empire on earth. But to understand why these men were freezing on a river in the dark, we must go back, not to war, but to a fragile hope planted more than 150 years earlier. Long before the word America meant a nation, it was an experiment fueled by desperation, faith, greed, and fear. In 1607, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, crept into the Chesapeake Bay. The men aboard were not heroes. Many were gentlemen who had never farmed, craftsmen who underestimated the wilderness, and adventurers chasing wealth they believed waited just beyond the trees. They named their settlement Jamestown in honor of King James I. Within months, disease, hunger, and internal conflict turned hope into horror. Swamps bred mosquitoes, food ran out, leadership collapsed. By the winter of 1609, desperation pushed the colony into what survivors would later call the starving time. People ate rats, leather shoes, even the unthinkable. Jamestown nearly vanished from history, and with it, the first English foothold in what would become the United States. It survived not because of planning, but because failure refused to finish the story. Further north, in 1620, another group crossed the Atlantic, not for gold, but for belief. The Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower were escaping religious persecution, but they were also stepping into chaos. They landed far from where they intended, in the cold, unforgiving soil of present-day Massachusetts. Before even setting foot on land, they signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement that bound them to govern together, not by royal decree, but by mutual consent. It was a small document, but it carried a revolutionary idea. Power could come from the people themselves. Half of them died that first winter. Yet the survivors endured. They learned from native tribes like the Wampanoag, whose help made survival possible, though history would later repay that help with betrayal and violence. From the beginning, America was born in contradiction. Freedom built alongside conquest, faith beside cruelty, hope intertwined with injustice. As colonies spread along the Atlantic coast, they developed separate identities. New England emphasized community and religion. The middle colonies thrived on trade and diversity. The southern colonies grew wealthy on agriculture and on the brutal system of enslaved labor. By the 1700s, enslaved Africans were the invisible backbone of colonial prosperity. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton built fortunes while millions lived and died in chains. The ideals of liberty spoken in meeting halls clashed violently with the reality of human bondage in the fields. Still, something new was forming. Colonists were not British enough for Britain and no longer European in spirit. They governed local affairs, built militias, traded freely, and began to see the Atlantic not as a lifeline, but as a distance from control. That distance frightened the British Crown. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain was drowning in debt. The solution, Parliament decided, was simple: make the colonies pay. Taxes arrived without representation, laws tightened, trade was restricted, soldiers marched into cities. The colonists protested. Britain ignored them. Then came the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, and finally, in 1770, blood spilled on snow in Boston. The Boston Massacre was not a massacre in scale, but it was one in symbolism. 5 colonists lay dead. Engravings spread across the colonies, fanning outrage. The message was clear. British power was no longer protective, it was oppressive. Resistance grew louder. Committees of correspondence spread ideas faster than armies could stop them. Pamphlets circulated through taverns and churches. One pamphlet, written by a recent immigrant named Thomas Paine, would ignite a fire no empire could extinguish. Common sense did not speak like a philosopher. It spoke like a man at a table, telling another man the truth plainly. It questioned monarchy itself. It asked why a small island should rule a vast continent. Hundreds of thousands read it. Millions felt it. When war finally came in 1775, it came clumsily. Farmers faced professional soldiers at Lexington and Concord. The British expected obedience. They found defiance. Yet defiance alone was not enough. The Continental Army was undertrained, underfed, and divided. Desertions were common. Supplies were scarce. Victory seemed impossible. That is why the crossing of the Delaware mattered so much. By December 1776, the rebellion was collapsing. New York had fallen. Morale was broken. Enlistments were expiring. Many believed independence was a mistake. Washington knew one bold strike could change everything. So on Christmas night, he gambled the future of a nation on ice and darkness. When dawn broke, Hessian soldiers in Trenton awoke not to church bells, but to musket fire. The victory was swift, shocking, and electrifying. For the first time, the world believed the impossible might actually happen. But independence would not be won in a single night. It would take 8 brutal years. It would take French alliances, foreign debt, lost cities, burned towns, and the blood of thousands who would never see the nation they helped create. And even after victory, the story was far from complete. Because winning freedom was only the beginning. The real question, the one that would haunt America for centuries, was this: who exactly was that freedom for?
When the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, the words looked clean and confident on parchment. But the truth was far messier. Outside Philadelphia's brick walls, the world was burning. The Declaration did not end the war, it hardened it. What had been a rebellion became treason. There would be no compromise now, no returning to the empire with lighter chains. Every man who signed the document knew that if the cause failed, he would hang. Yet even in that moment of unity, the fractures were already visible. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. He wrote it while owning human beings. John Adams demanded independence, but feared democracy itself. Alexander Hamilton dreamed of a strong central government that others called tyranny. Benjamin Franklin negotiated in salons while soldiers froze in rags. America was not born from agreement,
It was born from argument. As the war dragged on, the romantic image of liberty collided with reality. British forces captured New York and Philadelphia. Washington's army retreated again and again. Supplies disappeared. Congress argued. State militias refused to cooperate. Some colonists switched sides, choosing the crown over chaos. At Valley Forge in the winter of 1777, the revolution nearly died. Men slept without blankets, shoes disintegrated, disease spread faster than hope. One soldier wrote that the army looked more like ghosts than men. Desertions increased. Hunger erased idealism. What saved them was not victory, but discipline. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived with no official rank and a thick accent, but he brought something invaluable: training. He drilled soldiers, standardized commands, and taught them to fight like an army rather than a mob. Slowly, painfully, the Continental Army transformed. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Benjamin Franklin was performing a different kind of warfare. In France, he turned American struggle into European spectacle. He wore simple clothes, spoke of liberty, and convinced the French that helping the colonies would weaken Britain. French money, weapons, and eventually troops changed the balance of power. The war reached its turning point at Yorktown in 1781. British General Cornwallis expected rescue by sea. It never came. French ships blocked the harbor. American and French forces surrounded the town. Trapped, outnumbered, and exhausted, Cornwallis surrendered. The world took notice. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as an independent nation. The war was over. The nightmare had just begun. Peace exposed what war had hidden. The new nation was broke, divided, and bound by a weak framework known as the Articles of Confederation. There was no strong central government, no power to tax, no unified military. States acted like rival countries. Inflation destroyed savings. Veterans went unpaid. In Massachusetts, desperation turned into rebellion. In 1786, farmers led by Daniel Shays rose against courts that seized land over unpaid debts. The uprising terrified elites. If farmers could rebel against Britain, they could rebel against their own government too. Something had to change. So in 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, not to tweak the articles, but to replace them entirely. What followed was one of the most intense political debates in human history. Doors were shut, windows were sealed, guards posted. What they discussed would determine whether America became a republic or collapsed into tyranny. Large states demanded representation by population. Small states demanded equality. Slave states demanded protection. Free states resisted. The compromise that saved the convention also poisoned the future. Slavery was neither abolished nor fully protected. Instead, it was postponed. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, but given 0 rights. It was a political solution, not a moral one. The Constitution emerged strong but incomplete. To sell it to the public, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, arguing that a powerful government could coexist with liberty. Others feared centralized power as a new monarchy in disguise. The ratification battle split the nation. The Constitution passed, but only with the promise of a Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, religion, press, due process. Words meant to protect the people from their own government. In 1789, George Washington became the first president. The general who had rejected kingship now led a republic built on trust rather than force. But power has gravity. Political parties formed almost immediately. Hamilton's vision of finance and federal power clashed with Jefferson's agrarian ideal. The unity of revolution fractured into ideology. Beyond politics, the nation expanded westward. Native American nations stood in the path of progress and were crushed by it. Treaties were signed and broken. Land was seized. Resistance was labeled savagery. Expansion became destiny, and destiny became excuse. By the early 1800s, the United States was growing, but not healing. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size and doubled its greatest question: would slavery spread? Every new state reopened the wound. Compromises stacked like fragile scaffolding. Each one delayed collapse, but weakened the structure. The founding generation aged. Their warnings went unheeded. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1726, the same day as John Adams, 50 years after the Declaration they helped create. Their passing felt symbolic. The men who knew the cost of division were gone. What remained was a nation powerful enough to dream and divided enough to destroy itself. And the storm was coming. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States stood at the height of its ambition and at the edge of its own undoing. Railroads cut through forests and plains like steel veins. Telegraph wires carried words faster than horses ever could. Cities rose, factories roared, and immigrants poured in from Europe chasing a promise whispered across oceans. America was becoming powerful. But beneath that power lay a truth no compromise could bury any longer. The nation was built on two incompatible ideas, and only one could survive. In the North, industry reshaped life. Wage labor replaced plantations. Cities expanded. Education spread, and a growing population questioned the morality of slavery, not only as an economic system, but as a human crime. In the South, cotton ruled like a king. The invention of the cotton gin made slavery more profitable than ever. Plantations expanded westward. Enslaved men, women, and children were sold like tools. Families torn apart to satisfy markets hundreds of miles away. Southern leaders did not see slavery as a temporary evil. They defended it as a positive good, essential to their economy and social order. Any threat to it felt like a threat to their very existence. Every new territory reignited the fire. The Missouri Compromise tried to draw a line across the map. The Compromise of 1850 tried to calm the storm. The Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered what little peace remained, allowing settlers to vote slavery up or down with bullets instead of ballots. Kansas bled. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed in open violence. Homes burned. Men were murdered. The future of the nation was being rehearsed on a smaller stage. Then came a book. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin spread through the North like wildfire. It humanized the enslaved in ways political speeches never had. Southern leaders dismissed it as propaganda. Northern readers wept. Alexander Lincoln, still an obscure politician, would later say the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was the little lady who started this great war. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered a decision that shocked the nation. In Dred Scott versus Sanford, the court declared that Black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. The law spoke clearly. So did the silence of conscience. The decision told millions that the Constitution they trusted did not protect them at all. It told the North that compromise was dead. In 1859, a man named John Brown took the nation's fear and turned it into blood. At Harper's Ferry, Brown attempted to spark a slave uprising by seizing a federal arsenal. The plan failed. Brown was captured, tried, and executed. But his calm words at the gallows echoed across the country. Many in the North saw him as a martyr. Many in the South saw him as proof that abolition meant annihilation. Trust collapsed. When Abraham Lincoln ran for president in 1860, he did not call for immediate abolition everywhere. He called for preventing slavery's expansion. To the South, that alone was unforgivable. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. To Southern leaders, the message was unmistakable. Their political power was finished. One by one, states declared secession. They formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, built explicitly on the preservation of slavery. Lincoln stood firm. Secession, he said, was illegal. The Union was perpetual. When Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in April 1961, the debate ended. America went to war with itself. The Civil War was not glorious. It was mud, disease, amputations without anesthesia, and letters written by candlelight that would never reach home. Brothers fought brothers. Entire towns emptied into graveyards. Early battles shattered illusions. At Bull Run, spectators watched what they thought would be entertainment. They fled in panic as Union forces collapsed. Both sides believed victory would be swift. Both were wrong. The war dragged on, and with it came a transformation. At first, Lincoln fought to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But enslaved people forced the issue themselves. They fled plantations, crossed battle lines, and demanded freedom with their feet. By 1863, Lincoln understood the war could not be won without addressing its moral core. The Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom for enslaved people in rebel states. It did not end slavery everywhere, but it changed the meaning of the war forever. Now, Union soldiers fought not just for a country, but for liberation. Black Americans joined the fight. Nearly 180,000 served in the Union Army. They fought bravely, often receiving lower pay and harsher treatment. If captured, they faced execution or re-enslavement. They fought anyway. The war reached its climax at places whose names still echo: Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. Fields turned red. Rivers carried bodies downstream. At Gettysburg, Union forces turned back the Confederate invasion of the North. Months later, Lincoln stood on that blood-soaked ground and delivered a speech of fewer than 3 minutes. He spoke of a nation conceived in liberty and tested by war. He asked whether it could endure. The answer came at enormous cost. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union was saved. Slavery was dead. 600,000 Americans were dead with it. Days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour would not live to see what came next. Reconstruction began with hope and ended with betrayal. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1865, America stood victorious and morally exhausted. The Union had survived. Slavery, at least in law, was abolished. The 13th Amendment ended the legal ownership of human beings. For the first time, freedom was written clearly into the Constitution. But freedom written on paper did not mean freedom lived in reality. The South lay in ruins, cities burned, railroads twisted like broken bones, plantations collapsed. 4 million formerly enslaved people stepped into a world that had never imagined them as free citizens and had no intention of welcoming them as equals. Reconstruction began with promise. The federal government sent troops south to protect newly freed Black Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau helped establish schools, negotiate labor contracts, and provide food. Black men voted, held office, and participated in democracy for the first time in American history. For a brief moment, the future looked different. Then resistance organized. White supremacist groups formed in the shadows, the Ku Klux Klan most notorious among them. They terrorized Black communities with night rides, lynchings, and intimidation. Violence became a political weapon. Voting booths turned into battlefields. Many in the North grew tired. Reconstruction required will, money, and moral courage. Over time, that will faded. Economic depression shifted attention. Racism never disappeared. Compromise returned. In 1877, a political deal ended federal enforcement in the South. Troops withdrew. Reconstruction died quietly, not with a law, but with indifference. What followed was not reconciliation, it was revenge. Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws that segregated schools, transportation, housing, and public life. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence stripped Black Americans of the right to vote. The Supreme Court sanctioned separation under the lie of separate but equal. Lynchings became public spectacles, justice became selective, freedom became conditional. America had won the war and lost the peace. While the South sank into enforced inequality, the North and West exploded with industrial growth. Steel, oil, railroads, and finance transformed the nation. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan amassed fortunes larger than anything the world had seen. They were called captains of industry and robber barons. Factories roared, cities swelled, immigrants worked endless hours for pennies, children labored in mills, slums grew beside mansions. The American dream glittered, but only for a few. Workers organized, strikes erupted. At Haymarket, Pullman, and Homestead, labor protests turned violent. The government often sided with wealth, sending troops against workers demanding dignity. Progress came, but unevenly. The frontier closed. Native American nations were forced onto reservations. Cultures were erased. Children were taken to boarding schools where speaking their own language was punished. The promise of opportunity rested on displacement. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was powerful, wealthy, and deeply unequal. Then the world caught fire. World War I dragged the United States onto the global stage. American soldiers crossed oceans to fight a war sparked by old empires and new weapons. The war ended, but peace proved fragile. The 1920s roared with jazz, consumerism, and confidence. Stock markets soared. Prohibition fueled crime. Optimism blinded caution. In 1929, the illusion collapsed. The Great Depression crushed the nation. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Families lost farms, homes, dignity. Capitalism without restraint revealed its cruelty. President Franklin Roosevelt offered a new vision. The New Deal expanded government responsibility for the economy and social welfare. It did not end suffering overnight, but it reshaped the relationship between Americans and their government. Then came another war. World War II demanded total mobilization. Factories became arsenals. Women filled industrial jobs. Black Americans served abroad while facing discrimination at home. The fight against fascism exposed hypocrisy. Japanese Americans were imprisoned in internment camps, citizens stripped of rights in the name of security. Victory in 1945 left America as a global superpower. But peace did not bring unity. The Cold War divided the world and the nation. Fear of communism fueled loyalty tests, blacklists, and paranoia. Nuclear weapons threatened extinction. At home, another struggle demanded attention. Black Americans refused silence. The civil rights movement rose from centuries of pain. Through boycotts, marches, and sacrifice, they forced the nation to confront its lies. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of dreams deferred too long. Others demanded justice by any means necessary. Change came through blood and courage. Civil rights laws dismantled legal segregation. Voting rights were restored. Progress arrived, slow, fragile, incomplete. America entered the late 20th century richer, freer, and still divided. The wars in Vietnam, the assassinations of leaders, the rise of distrust, all revealed a nation questioning itself again. History had not ended. It never does. Because the American story is not a straight line forward. It is a struggle between ideals and reality, between who the nation claims to be and who it allows itself to become. Victory without justice leaves wounds, and those wounds, ignored long enough, always reopen. By the time the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the United States had become something its founders could barely imagine. A nation born as a fragile experiment had grown into a global superpower, its currency shaping markets, its military stationed across continents, its culture broadcast through screens into every corner of the world. Yet power did not bring certainty. It brought questions. After World War II, prosperity lifted millions into the middle class. Suburbs expanded, highways connected coasts, colleges filled with students whose parents had never dreamed of higher education. The American dream seemed tangible. Own a home, raise a family, build a future better than the past. But prosperity did not reach everyone equally. Redlining trapped black families in underfunded neighborhoods. Wealth accumulated in white households, while others were excluded by design. Schools reflected zip codes. Opportunity followed inheritance more than effort. The civil rights victories of the 1960s were monumental, but they were not endings. They were beginnings. As laws changed, attitudes resisted. When factories began to close in the 1970s and 1980s, entire communities collapsed. Jobs moved overseas. Automation replaced labor. The same government that once protected workers now spoke the language of deregulation and markets. Inequality widened. At the same time, America's confidence faltered abroad. Vietnam ended not in victory, but in trauma. Watergate shattered trust in leadership. The idea that America was always right, always noble, became harder to defend. Yet the nation adapted. Technology transformed life. Computers shrank. The internet connected strangers. Information became instant and overwhelming. Truth competed with noise. The Cold War ended without nuclear fire. The Soviet Union collapsed. America stood alone at the top of the world. For a moment, it believed history itself had been won. Then came September 11th, 2001. On a clear morning, terror ripped through New York and Washington. The nation watched towers fall in disbelief. Fear united Americans, but fear also narrowed judgment. Wars followed. Surveillance expanded. Security challenged liberty once again. The same tension that existed in 1776 returned in modern form. How much freedom could be sacrificed for safety? The answer shifted with every crisis. The financial collapse of 2008 exposed the fragility beneath prosperity. Banks were rescued, families were not. Anger spread, trust eroded further. Social media amplified voices, but also divisions. Identity, race, class, and ideology hardened into lines that felt impossible to cross. Every election felt existential. Every disagreement felt final. The past returned, not as memory, but as argument. Statues fell. Textbooks were challenged. The meaning of patriotism itself was debated. Some clung to an idealized past. Others demanded acknowledgement of historical crimes long ignored. Both claimed to love America. Both feared losing it. And yet, through all of this, the core contradiction remained unchanged. The United States was founded on an idea more radical than any army, that people could govern themselves, that power belonged not to kings or bloodlines, but to citizens. That idea was never finished. It survived because it was challenged. Every generation inherited an incomplete nation and was forced to decide whether to expand the promise or shrink it. From the frozen river at Delaware to the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg, to the marches across southern bridges, to the debates raging online and in streets today, the story is not about perfection, it is about struggle. America has failed many times. It has also corrected itself, slowly, painfully, imperfectly. The truth is uncomfortable. Freedom was delayed. Justice was denied. Equality was conditional. But the idea endured. And that idea, that a nation can confront its own flaws and still strive forward, is why the American story matters beyond borders. The United States is not a finished monument. It is a conversation, a conflict between its highest ideals and its deepest fears. Whether it survives another century does not depend on myths, but on memory, on the willingness to look honestly at where it came from, what it has done, and what it still owes. Because the real inheritance of America is not land or power, it is responsibility. And the question that echoes from the past into the present, into every generation, is the same one George Washington faced in the dark on the Delaware River. Do we turn back, or do we cross, knowing the cost?